Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating text that attempts something absolutely massive. It actually frames virtually all of human history as an epic, ongoing struggle between free thought and systems of control. We're going to explore how early human survival tactics morphed into complex belief systems, and ultimately how the author argues these structures might be impacting your ability to think independently today. It's a sweeping look at humanity, so get comfortable and let's get into it. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the dawn of shared belief, move into empires and freethinkers, explore a tradition of inquiry, examine the true modern conflicts, and finally wrap up with turning on the light. Section 1. The dawn of shared belief. To really understand the author's argument about modern control, we first have to rewind the clock. Imagine, it's 11,000 years ago. Humans are nomadic, basically just sharing ideas around a fire to survive the night. And through these discussions, they naturally started wondering about some higher power of nature. But notice the shift that happens around 7,000 years ago. As groups became more settled and organized, the dynamic completely changed. The text argues that early leaders figured out they could claim a special, exclusive connection with God. And they used this claim to gain authority, eventually demanding unquestioning obedience from their followers, as competition between different tribes really started heating up. A perfect example of this shift, at least according to the source material, is the Babylonians. The text points out that, at first, they tried to gain influence by literally building a tower to reach God. When that physical effort inevitably failed, they didn't just give up. No, they pivoted. Talk about an ancient PR strategy. They turned to writing, explaining the world through their own texts. But crucially, they presented these human-written ideas as absolute, unquestionable divine truth. It was a really early mechanism for establishing unshakable authority over the people. Section 2. Empires and freethinkers. Let's see what happens when those local power structures scale up into massive empires. When juggernauts like the Roman Empire emerged, the author argues they basically took these early concepts and supersized them. They used belief systems as tools to strictly unify and control massive, diverse populations. So, the traditions and laws we often view as divine, the text suggests they were actually heavily shaped by the very human, political realities of that specific era. But hey, there was pushback. Groups like the North African Berbers fiercely resisted this imperial control. And for a lot of everyday people facing down these powerful empires, outward religious identities were often adopted just to survive, even if their inner beliefs remained totally independent. But even within these incredibly rigid empires, resistance existed at the very top. Take Pharaoh Akhenaten. In ancient Egypt, rulers were seen as literal walking gods. Yet Akhenaten completely flipped the script. He challenged traditional beliefs by proposing this radical idea of one universal creator and a single unifying energy. The text uses him as a case study to show that free thought has literally always existed, even though Akhenaten faced massive resistance and his ideas were violently suppressed after he died. The author then points to Moses. Now, in the context of this explainer, Moses isn't just viewed through your standard religious lens. Instead, the text frames him as this powerful, symbolic figure, representing leadership and, most importantly, moral courage. He stands in for the kind of independent thinking that actively pushes human understanding forward and breaks away from the oppressive systems of the time. And that individual courage eventually built into a much wider philosophical tradition. The author points to Maimonides, also known as the Rambam. He was a scholar who focused heavily on health, balance, and ethics. The text uses his work to demonstrate a long, rich tradition of individuals who championed constant learning, questioning, and open debate, prioritizing that way above blind obedience. Section 3. A tradition of inquiry. So, how did this constant tension between control and free thought actually shape everyday practices and modern borders? Well, take kosher practices, for example. Rather than viewing these dietary laws purely as strict, unquestionable decrees from above, the author argues they developed organically. They stemmed from a deep human desire to understand health, cleanliness, and the actual biological relationship between us and the food we eat. It really reframes these traditions as early forms of scientific inquiry and a genuine practical concern for human well-being. And this concept of human-driven structures extends right into our modern political maps. Looking at the Middle East, the text argues that the borders, kingdoms, and political identities we see today didn't just fall from the sky. They were heavily influenced and literally drawn by European powers based on the political and economic interest of that specific time. It's a solid reminder that national historical narratives aren't set in stone. They're constructed and they constantly evolve right alongside human societies. Section 4. The true modern conflict. If our traditions and our borders are shaped by human history, how should we view the conflicts of today? This brings us to the real core of the author's worldview. It's a pretty stark contrast. On one side, you have blind obedience. According to the author, this is maintained by institutions using fear, propaganda, and intense social pressure. It strips away your individual responsibility and ultimately leads right to extremism. On the flip side, you have independent thought. This relies on science, education, open debate, and crucially, personal moral responsibility. For the author, independent thought is the absolute bedrock of a healthy, functioning, democratic society. The author captures this whole dynamic in one absolutely crucial thought. The central conflict of modern society is not between religions or nations, but between free thought and systems of control. Think about that. When you watch the news and see clashes between nations or faiths, the author is urging you to look a layer deeper. The actual underlying battle is whether you choose to think independently or whether you submit to institutional manipulation. Section 5. Turning on the light. I know, this all sounds a bit daunting, right? But how do we actually navigate this in our own daily lives? The author uses a fantastic metaphor to explain the solution. Consider this idea. Darkness is not a force by itself. It is simply the absence of light. The text is arguing that all those oppressive systems of control, the propaganda, the fear we've been talking about, they aren't actually unstoppable physical forces. They only have power in the dark. They literally only work when we aren't looking closely at them. In this view, ignorance is the darkness. It's simply a state that exists where knowledge is missing. But the text makes a really poignant observation here. Ignorance functions almost like a comforting addiction. Blind faith, maintained by constant repetition, gives people the sense of absolute certainty. It's cozy, it feels safe. But that comfort actively prevents us from questioning the world around us and seeking out a deeper, more accurate truth. So how do you flip the switch? How do you turn on the light? The author suggests a clear, 3-step process. First, just acknowledge and accept that change and the unfamiliar feel frightening. That is a totally normal human reaction. Second, push through that fear to explore ideas openly and honestly, relying on science and actual knowledge. And third, through that honest inquiry, discover that questioning doesn't lead to chaos or fear at all. It actually leads to profound personal growth and true understanding. Ultimately, the text is arguing for a complete paradigm shift in how we build a moral society. It shouldn't be built on a shaky foundation of fear, hatred, or blind belief. Instead, it has to be based on education, robust debate, and human creativity. When we realize that life has deep meaning well beyond institutional manipulation, we become more confident and ethical. True morality, the author insists, comes from self-awareness and compassion, always striving for humanity, dignity, and total freedom from ideological fanaticism. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought. Think about the values you hold most dear. Are your core beliefs simply the result of inherited tradition and the social pressure of the groups you happen to belong to? Or have you done the hard work, faced the fear of the unknown, and truly turned on the light through your own independent inquiry? It's a profound question, and answering it honestly just might change how you view the entire world. Thanks for learning with me today.